Chapter 1: The Weight of Invisibility. The silver trays felt heavier than usual tonight, the polished metal biting into Naira's calloused palms as she navigated the crowded ballroom. Crystal chandeliers overhead dripped with light, casting sharp, jagged shadows across the faces of the elite. These were the high-ranking members of the Crescent Moon Pack, a sea of silk and expensive cologne that masked the primal scent of predator beneath. Because she was Omega-born and bond-broken, she moved through them like a ghost, a flicker of movement they refused to acknowledge. The air tasted of pine needles and arrogance. It was a suffocating combination that made her lungs burn with every shallow breath. Why did the world feel so small when the room was so vast? Following the path of least resistance, she slipped toward the buffet line, her movements practiced and fluid. She had learned long ago that if you didn't meet their eyes, you didn't exist. This invisibility was her armor, yet tonight it felt like a leaden shroud. A group of she-wolves stood near the punch bowl, their laughter sharp as shattered glass. They wore dresses that cost more than Naira would see in a lifetime of service. As she approached to clear a discarded glass, the tallest one, a blonde with eyes like frozen pond water, leaned in closer to her friends. The girl's voice wasn't a whisper. It was a weapon intended to draw blood. "Can you imagine being so unwanted that even the moon goddess turns her back on you?" The blonde sneered, her gaze flicking toward Naira for a fraction of a second. "I heard her own fated mate wouldn't even finish the ceremony before he started looking for a replacement. Some things are just born broken, I suppose." Naira's fingers tightened on the tray, the metal groaning under the sudden pressure of her grip. A hot flash of shame crawled up her neck, staining her cheeks a dusty crimson. She focused on a singular bead of condensation rolling down a wine bottle, counting the seconds until she could retreat. She expected rejection before it even happened, a self-fulfilling prophecy that governed every beat of her heart. It was a bitter pill she swallowed daily, yet the taste never became familiar. Her internal world was a landscape of gray ash where hope had been burned away years ago. Moving away from the mocking group, she retreated toward the kitchens, the swinging doors providing a momentary sanctuary from the judgmental glares. The heat of the ovens hit her face, a physical manifestation of the pressure building behind her eyes. She leaned against a cold stone wall, the dampness seeping through her thin uniform. Why did fate choose her to be a mate if it only intended to let her be discarded? That question haunted her every waking moment, a jagged hook buried deep in her psyche. She wasn't just unchosen, she felt fundamentally flawed, a mistake in the grand design of the universe. Stepping back into the fray was a choice she made with gritted teeth. She had a job to do, and survival required her to endure the humiliation. As she re-entered the ballroom, the atmosphere had shifted, the collective heart rate of the room accelerating into a frantic rhythm. The Alpha King had arrived. He sat at the far end of the hall on a dais carved from ancient oak, his presence a gravitational force that pulled every eye in his direction. Kael was a legend wrapped in shadows, a man whose reputation for ruthlessness was matched only by his absolute isolation. He looked like a god carved from obsidian, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Beside the refreshment table, a group of young enforcers were playing a dangerous game of bravado. They were drunk on power and expensive whiskey, their voices carrying over the swell of the orchestra. One of them, a man with a jagged scar across his chin, pointed a shaking finger toward the high table. "Look at her, the little ghost girl," he laughed, noticing Naira hovering in the periphery. "Hey, Omega, I bet 1,000 credits you wouldn't dare take a seat next to the king. I bet he'd snap your neck before you even hit the cushion." The challenge hung in the air, thick and provocative. Naira looked from the mocking faces of the enforcers to the solitary figure of the king. A sudden, irrational spark of defiance ignited in her chest, a wildfire born from years of suppression. She was exhausted from being the girl who hid in the corners. What was the worst he could do? Kill her? That felt like a mercy compared to a lifetime of being a punchline. She set her tray down on a nearby table with a decisive click that signaled the end of her patience. Walking toward the dais, she felt the eyes of the entire pack boring into her back. The silence spread like an oil slick, devouring the music and the chatter until only the sound of her heartbeat remained. It was a frantic, thumping drum that echoed in her ears. Each step was a bridge burned, a bridge she had no intention of rebuilding. She reached the edge of the king's platform, the air here vibrating with an intensity that made the hair on her arms stand up. Kael didn't move, his profile as still as a statue, but the atmosphere around him grew heavy enough to crush bone. She didn't think, she simply acted, lowering herself onto the velvet chair directly to his right. The collective gasp of the room was the last thing she heard before the world narrowed down to the man beside her. Chapter 2. The Shattered Silence. The velvet beneath Naira felt like a bed of needles, every nerve in her body screaming at the audacity of her own actions. She sat perfectly still, her gaze fixed on the far wall as if she could disappear into the plaster. Beside her, the Alpha King was a mountain of silent thunder. The scent of him hit her then. Dark chocolate, rain-soaked earth, and something dangerously metallic like a sharpening blade. It was a sensory assault that bypassed her logic and went straight to the dormant wolf shivering in the basement of her soul. She had expected a swift execution, but the silence was far more agonizing. Kael turned his head with a slow, predatory grace that made the air flee from her lungs. When his eyes met hers, the world didn't just stop. It fractured. They were eyes of molten gold, burning with a recognition that felt like a physical blow to her solar plexus. He didn't snarl or call for the guards. Instead, he simply stared, his nostrils flaring as he took in her scent. The room remained frozen, a tableau of shocked faces and suspended breaths. People were waiting for the explosion, for the king to cast the lowly servant from his sight, but the violence never came. Naira, he whispered, the sound of her name on his tongue like a low, vibrating hum. It wasn't a question. It was a decree. He stood up, his massive frame casting a shadow that swallowed her entirely. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't acknowledge the pack alpha who was turning purple with confusion. He reached out, his large hand hovering inches from her face before he pulled back, his fingers curling into a tight fist. Then, with a voice that carried to every corner of the silent hall, he spoke the words that would destroy her life and rebuild it in the same breath. This woman is my mate. Anyone who dares to look at her with anything less than reverence will answer to my claws. Shock hit Naira like a tidal wave, followed immediately by a burning, righteous anger. She didn't feel chosen. She felt mocked by the universe. How could this man, the most powerful creature in the kingdom, claim her after she had been discarded like trash by a common soldier? She stood up, her small stature a stark contrast to his overwhelming height. Her laugh was a jagged thing, devoid of mirth, echoing through the hall with a defiance that bordered on madness. "You're a liar," she spat, her voice trembling with the weight of her trauma. "The moon goddess doesn't give gifts to people like me. I was rejected, I am broken, I am the girl people step over to get to someone better. Don't use me for whatever political game you're playing." Kael stepped closer, the heat radiating off him enough to make her dizzy. He didn't flinch at her outburst. If anything, his expression softened into something that looked terrifyingly like possessiveness. The bond between them, which she had tried so hard to ignore, suddenly flared to life. It was a golden thread pulling at her heart, demanding her attention. She fought it with everything she had because accepting this meant risking a pain she knew she wouldn't survive a second time. She wasn't going to be a second choice, even if the man choosing her was a king. "You feel it too, little wolf," Kael murmured, leaning down so only she could hear the rumble in his chest. "Your soul is screaming for mine. You can deny me in front of these cowards, but you cannot deny the blood in your veins." The room began to murmur, the shock wearing off and being replaced by a toxic wave of hostility. The high-ranking females were looking at Naira with murder in their eyes. They had spent years trying to catch the king's attention, and here was an Omega servant claiming his crown. The air grew thick with the scent of agitation and unsheathed claws. Naira realized with a jolt of terror that her identity had flipped in an instant. She was no longer invisible. She was a target. She turned to flee, but Kael's hand shot out, catching her wrist with a grip that was firm but surprisingly gentle. "Release me!" she hissed, tugging against his hold. "I cannot," he replied, his gaze scanning the room with a lethal intensity. "The moment I claimed you, I painted a bullseye on your back. You aren't safe here anymore. You're coming with me." The rejection she had lived with for years was a cold, familiar companion, but this new reality was a chaotic fire. She didn't trust him. She didn't trust the way her heart skipped a beat when his thumb brushed against her pulse point. She was convinced this was a cruel joke or a temporary madness. As he led her out of the ballroom, she looked back one last time at the people who had mocked her. They weren't laughing now, but their silence held a promise of blood. She was being pulled into a world of gold and shadows, and she knew, with a sinking feeling in her gut, that there was no way back to the girl she used to be. Chapter 3: The Gilded Cage. The carriage ride to the Alpha King's palace was a blur of dark trees and the heavy, rhythmic thud of horses' hooves. Naira sat as far away from Kael as the leather bench allowed, her hands tucked into her armpits to hide their shaking. He didn't try to touch her again, but his presence filled the small space like a physical weight. The silence between them was a living thing, stretched thin and vibrating with unspoken questions. She wanted to scream at him, to demand why he had done this, but the words felt like dry crackers in her throat. Upon arrival, the palace loomed out of the mist like a Gothic nightmare. It was a fortress of black stone and gleaming glass, perched on the edge of a jagged cliff. As they stepped out of the carriage, rows of servants lined the entrance, their heads bowed so low their foreheads nearly touched the gravel. This was the respect she had never known, yet it felt hollow and unearned. She walked beside Kael, her chin held high even as her stomach did somersaults. Every step into the palace felt like a step further away from her own agency. "This will be your home now," Kael said as they entered a foyer larger than the entire pack house she had grown up in. "My guards will be stationed at your door. My staff will provide whatever you require. You are the Luna of this kingdom." "I am a prisoner in a prettier cage," Naira countered, her voice echoing off the marble floors. She turned to face him, the anger from the ballroom returning in a sharp, cold wave. "You didn't ask me if I wanted this. You didn't ask if I was ready to be your mate. You just took me because that's what alphas do. You take what you want and expect the world to thank you for it." Kael stopped, his expression unreadable in the flickering torchlight. "I took you because if I had left you there, you wouldn't have survived the night. Do you truly think the woman you humiliated would have let you sleep in peace? I am protecting what is mine." "I am not yours," she yelled, the sound startling a nearby servant who dropped a silver tray with a deafening clang. The irony of the sound wasn't lost on her. "I was rejected once, and I learned my lesson. I don't need a mate to define me, and I certainly don't need a king to save me." She turned and ran up the grand staircase, her feet flying over the plush carpet. She didn't know where she was going, but she needed to be away from him, away from the golden eyes that seemed to see every crack in her soul. She found herself in a long hallway lined with tapestries depicting ancient wars. As she slowed to a stop, catching her breath, she heard voices drifting from a half-open door. It was two maids, their whispers sharp and venomous. "She won't last a week," one said, the sound of fabric rustling accompanying her words. "The king is just reacting to the bond. Once the initial heat fades, he'll realize she's just an omega with a broken wolf. He needs a queen, not a stray. She'll be replaced soon enough." Naira felt the familiar sting of those words, a bitter confirmation of her deepest fears. They were right, weren't they? She was a temporary fix, a momentary lapse in Kael's judgment. Her internal flaw resurfaced with a vengeance, the absolute certainty that she was a placeholder for someone better. She leaned her head against the cool wood of the doorframe, fighting the urge to cry. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Later that night, the first real danger arrived. She was sitting by the window in her assigned chambers, staring out at the moon, when the glass shattered inward. A heavy iron bolt thudded into the high back of the chair she had been sitting in seconds before. She scrambled to the floor, her heart racing as she crawled toward the bed. Another bolt whistled through the air, narrowly missing her head. This wasn't a warning. It was an assassination attempt. The door burst open, and Kael was there in an instant, his shirt discarded and his claws extended. He didn't look like a king anymore. He looked like a monster. His rage was a physical force that rattled the furniture. He lunged across the room, shielding her body with his own as more projectiles shattered the remaining windows. He was growling, a deep primal sound that vibrated through her bones. In that moment of terror, as she clung to his back, Naira realized the stakes had shifted again. This wasn't just about a bond she didn't want. Someone wanted her dead because of who she was to him. She looked at the iron bolt buried in the wood, and for the first time, her fear was matched by a rising, incandescent anger. They thought she was weak. They thought she was easy to break. They were wrong. Chapter 4: The Predator's Shadow. Morning light bled through the shattered window frames like a bruised violet, the cold mountain air whistling through the jagged glass. Naira sat on the edge of the oversized bed, her fingers tracing the splintered wood where the iron bolt had struck. The adrenaline of the night had subsided, leaving behind a hollow, metallic ache in her chest. Because Kael had stood over her like a wall of living muscle until dawn, she hadn't slept a wink. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the murderous glint of the projectile aimed at her throat. She wasn't just a servant anymore. She was a target in a war she didn't understand. Kael stood by the balcony, his back a map of scars and tension that told stories of battles she could only imagine. He had refused to leave the room, his wolf pacing just beneath the surface of his skin. The scent of him, charred cedar and raw power, filled the chamber, grounding her even as it terrified her. She watched the way his muscles rippled with every breath, a silent reminder that he was the apex of their kind. Why did he look so haunted? The King of the North shouldn't look like a man waiting for the sky to fall. "You cannot stay in this room," Kael said, his voice a low vibration that rattled the crystal perfume bottles on the vanity. He turned to face her, his golden eyes bloodshot and fierce. "The breach was too easy. My internal security has been compromised, which means the enemy isn't just at the gates. They're sitting at my table. You are the only leverage they have over me." "I am not leverage," Naira countered, her voice raspy from the cold. She stood up, smoothing the wrinkles in her borrowed silk robe. "I am a person who was doing perfectly fine being invisible until you decided to make me a centerpiece. If I'm a target, it's because you put the bullseye there." He crossed the room in 2 strides, stopping so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. "I didn't choose the timing, Naira. The bond doesn't care about politics or safety. It triggered the moment you sat on that chair, and now your life is tethered to mine. If you die, I become a feral beast that will tear this kingdom apart." "Then let me go," she whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "If I'm not here, they have no reason to hunt me. Let me go back to the kitchens where I belong." Kael's hand shot out, but instead of the harsh grip she expected, he cupped her jaw with a tenderness that made her breath hitch. His thumb brushed over her lower lip, a touch so electric it sent a shiver down her spine. "They saw me claim you. There is no going back. You are the Alpha Queen now, whether you want the crown or not. Since you cannot hide, I will teach you how to bite." He led her down to the private training grounds, a sunken stone arena hidden beneath the palace. The air here was damp and smelled of old sweat and iron. He stripped off his tunic, revealing a physique that was a testament to centuries of survival. He didn't offer her a weapon. He offered her his hand. For the next 3 hours, he pushed her until her lungs screamed and her muscles turned to jelly. He wasn't gentle. He forced her to find the spark of aggression she had buried under years of servitude. "Again!" he roared as she fell to the stone floor for the 10th time. "Stop waiting for me to hit you. Anticipate the movement. Use your height. You're faster than I am, but you're playing the victim. Stop being the girl they broke. Naira scrambled up, her hair matted with sweat, her eyes burning with a sudden incandescent fury. She didn't see the king. She saw every person who had ever laughed at her, every girl who had whispered about her rejection. She lunged at him, not with a calculated move, but with raw, unadulterated rage. She managed to duck under his arm and land a solid blow to his ribs. Kael let out a grunt of surprise, his eyes flashing with a mix of pain and pride. He caught her by the waist, swinging her around until her back was pressed against his chest. "There she is," he murmured against her ear, his breath hot and ragged. "There is the wolf I smelled in that ballroom." She froze, the proximity of his body sending a different kind of heat through her veins. The anger was still there, but it was being rapidly overtaken by a primal attraction she couldn't suppress. He didn't let go. His hands lingered on her hips, his touch a claim that felt more intimate than any public declaration. She wanted to pull away, to maintain the walls she had built, but her body was betraying her. She felt the heavy thud of his heart against her spine, a rhythm that matched her own. "Don't do that," she choked out, her head falling back against his shoulder. "Don't make me want this." "Why not?" Kael asked, his voice dropping to a seductive rumble. "Because you think you're a second choice? Because you think the man who rejected you was right? He was a fool who couldn't see the sun because he was staring at the mud." He turned her around in his arms, his gaze searching hers for a sign of surrender. The tension between them was a physical cord, stretched to the breaking point. Just as he leaned in, his lips inches from hers, a frantic guard appeared at the top of the stone steps. The man looked pale, his eyes wide with a terror that broke the spell instantly. "My king!" the guard shouted, his voice echoing through the arena. "The dungeon! The prisoner from last night's attack. He's dead. And he wasn't just a rogue. He was wearing the crest of the Silver Blood Pack." Naira felt the blood drain from her face. The Silver Blood Pack was the home of her former mate. The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a random assassination attempt. This was personal. The past she had tried to bury was coming for her with a blade in its hand. Kael's grip on her tightened, his face hardening into a mask of lethal intent. The training was over. The war had officially arrived at their doorstep. Chapter 5. The Architect of Ruin. The palace felt smaller tonight, the walls closing in as the sun dipped below the horizon. Naira paced the length of the library, the scent of old parchment and beeswax failing to soothe her frayed nerves. Kael had been locked in the war room for hours, leaving her with nothing but her own spiraling thoughts. She felt like a pawn on a chessboard where the players were invisible and the rules kept changing. Why was her former pack involved in this? She was a nobody to them, a discarded Omega who should have been forgotten. A shadow flickered near the tall mahogany bookshelves, and Naira spun around, her heart jumping into her throat. An elderly woman stepped into the light, her face a map of deep wrinkles and knowing eyes. This was Elara, the palace archivist, and a woman rumored to have seen the reign of 3 kings. She held a heavy leather-bound volume in her withered hands, her gaze fixed on Naira with an intensity that felt like a probe. "The truth is a heavy burden, child," Elara said, her voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "Most people prefer the comfort of a lie because it doesn't require them to change. But you have been living a lie crafted by others for far too long." "I don't know what you're talking about," Naira replied, her hand hovering near a heavy bronze bust she could use as a weapon. "I'm just an Omega who got caught in a bond she doesn't want." Elara laughed, a dry, hacking sound. She placed the book on a reading table and beckoned Naira closer. "You were never an Omega, and that rejection you carry like a badge of shame? It was a masterpiece of deception. Come, look at the records of your birth. Look at what was stolen from you before you were old enough to shift." Naira approached the table with a sense of impending doom. As she looked at the yellowed pages, her breath hitched. There were diagrams of bloodlines, complex family trees that led directly to her name. but the symbol next to her name wasn't the Greek letter for Omega. It was a sunburst, the ancient mark of a seer wolf, a rare lineage capable of sensing the threads of fate. She read further, her eyes scanning the notes of a pack doctor from 15 years ago. Subject shows extreme dormant power. The Alpha has ordered the administration of Moonblight to suppress the wolf and the gift. If she shifts, she will be too powerful to control. If she stays human, she is a useful tool for marriage alliances. The world tilted on its axis. She hadn't been born broken, she had been poisoned. The reason her wolf had never emerged, the reason she felt so empty and discarded, was because the people she trusted had lobotomized her spirit. The rejection by her mate hadn't been a matter of the heart. It had been a calculated move to keep her status low so she wouldn't realize her own potential. They feared her. They had always feared her. Then, "I was never the problem?" she whispered, the words trembling with a decade of suppressed pain. "You were the solution they didn't want," Alara replied, closing the book with a heavy thud. "And now that Kael has claimed you, the poison is failing. The bond is a catalyst. Your wolf is waking up, Naira, and she is very, very angry." Rage, cold and sharp, flooded Naira's system. It was a different kind of anger than she had felt in the training arena. This was a soul-deep fury directed at the architects of her misery. She didn't notice the way the room began to vibrate or the way the candles flared with a brilliant white light. She only saw the faces of the elders who had looked down on her while they held the needle. She was so lost in her internal storm that she didn't hear Kael enter the room until he was standing right behind her. "I found the correspondence," Kael said, his voice tight with a suppressed violence. He held a handful of scorched letters. "Your former Alpha didn't just send an assassin, he sent a demand. He wants you returned for re-education, or he will declare open war on the northern borders. He's terrified of what you're becoming." Naira turned to him, and for the first time she didn't see a stranger. She saw the man who had inadvertently saved her from a life of chemical slavery. The golden thread of the bond felt stronger now, no longer a chain but a lifeline. She reached out and took the letters from his hand, her touch steady. "He won't get me back," she said, her voice vibrating with a power she didn't recognize. "And he won't get to hurt anyone else. If he wants a war, let's give him one he can't win." Kael's eyes widened as he looked at her. The air around her was shimmering with a faint, iridescent glow. He saw the shift in her posture, the way the invisible girl was dissolving to reveal something ancient and fierce. He didn't see a victim anymore. He saw a queen who was finally realizing she held the scepter. He stepped closer, his hand coming up to stroke her hair, his expression one of absolute devotion. "I will burn his entire world to the ground if that is what you wish," Kael promised, his voice a lethal vow. "But first, we have to wake your wolf. She's been sleeping in the dark for too long." The intimacy of the moment was thick and suffocating. Naira felt the urge to lean into him, to let him carry the weight of her revelation. But she pulled back slightly, her eyes narrowing. She couldn't fully trust him yet, not while his crown still came before her safety. "Why are you doing this, Kael? Is it just the bond? Or do you actually see me?" "I see the woman who laughed at a king in front of 1,000 people," he replied, a genuine smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "The bond just gave me the excuse to keep you. Now I have to prove I'm worthy of staying." Chapter 6. The Edge of the Blade. The mountain pass was a jagged scar of gray rock and frozen mud, the perfect place for an ambush. Kael had insisted on moving Naira to a secondary fortress further north, a place where the ancient magics of the land were stronger. He believed the proximity to the ancestral heart would help her break through the final layers of the moonblight suppression. They traveled with a small, elite guard, moving under the cover of a brewing storm. The wind howled through the pines, a mournful sound that echoed Naira's internal state. Inside the reinforced carriage, the tension was a physical pressure. Kael was checking his weapons, his movements methodical and cold. He was in full alpha mode, his senses dialed to the maximum. Naira watched him, feeling a strange mix of admiration and resentment. He was her protector, yes, but he was also the person who had upended her entire existence. She was caught between wanting to run into the woods and wanting to crawl into his lap. "We're being followed," Kael said suddenly, his head snapping toward the rear of the carriage. "Two groups, one behind us and one cutting through the ridge to get ahead of us. They're coordinated." "Is it him?" Naira asked, her hand going to the small silver dagger Kael had given her. "My former mate?" "He's leading the ridge group," Kael spat, his eyes glowing a dangerous molten orange. "He thinks he can catch us in the Narrows. He's underestimated how much I'm willing to lose to keep you safe." The carriage lurched as the horses were whipped into a gallop. The sound of shouting and the clash of steel soon followed. The ambush had begun. Kael didn't wait. He kicked open the carriage door and shifted mid-air, his human form exploding into a massive jet-black wolf that was the size of a grizzly bear. He hit the ground running, a blur of fur and fury that tore into the first wave of attackers. Naira didn't stay in the carriage. She knew she was a sitting duck inside the wooden box. She scrambled out, her boots hitting the slushy mud as she dove behind a fallen log. The air was filled with the sounds of a primal slaughter, the snapping of bone, the wet thud of impact, and the terrifying howls of shifting wolves. She saw Kael in the center of the fray, a whirlwind of violence that left a trail of blood in its wake. He was fighting 5 men at once, his movements a brutal dance of survival. Then, a familiar scent hit her. It was a scent that used to mean safety, but now smelled like rotting fruit and betrayal. From the shadows of the pines, a tall man emerged. He wasn't shifted, his expression one of arrogant boredom as he watched the carnage. This was Silas, the man who had stood in a crowded room and told the world Naira wasn't good enough for him. "You look pathetic, Naira," Silas said, his voice carrying over the din of battle. "Running with a monster like Kael. Did you really think a few days in a palace would change what you are? You're an Omega. You're a footnote. Come back now, and I might convince the elders to only lock you away for a decade." "I'm not the girl you broke, Silas," Naira replied, her voice steady despite the trembling of her knees. She stood up, the silver dagger glinting in the moonlight. "And I'm certainly not an Omega. I know what you did. I know about the moonblight." Silas's expression shifted from boredom to a sharp, predatory anger. "You were never supposed to find out. It doesn't matter anyway. A suppressed wolf is a dead wolf. You have no power here." He lunged at her, his speed incredible even in human form. Naira ducked, but he was too fast. He caught her by the throat, pinning her against a tree with a force that made her vision blur. He leaned in, his eyes dark with a twisted kind of satisfaction. "I rejected you because you were a threat. I'll kill you because you're a nuisance." As the air began to leave her lungs, Naira felt a sudden, violent heat in her solar plexus. It wasn't the heat of the bond. It was something older, something that had been screaming in the dark for 15 years. The moonblight within her blood met the incandescent rage of her spirit and shattered. A sound like 1,000 bells ringing filled her head. Her skin began to glow with a blinding white light, the temperature around her skyrocketing until Silas screamed, his hands blistering as he was forced to let go. Naira didn't fall. She stayed upright, her eyes no longer brown but a searing, brilliant silver. Her wolf didn't just emerge. It exploded outward in a wave of raw, kinetic energy that leveled the nearby trees. She wasn't a black wolf or a brown wolf. She was a creature of pure, starlit white, her fur shimmering like a nebula. She let out a howl that wasn't a sound of pain, but a declaration of war. Every wolf on the battlefield froze, the primal power of a seer wolf washing over them like a physical weight. Silas backed away, his face pale with a terror he couldn't hide. What are you?" Naira didn't answer with words. She lunged, a streak of white lightning that bore him to the ground. But before she could finish him, a sharp whistle pierced the air. A group of men in black tactical gear emerged from the ridge, firing tranquilizer darts tipped with a shimmering purple liquid. They weren't from the Silver Blood Pack. They were something else entirely. She felt the sting in her shoulder, the cold poison of the sedative hitting her system. The world began to spin. She saw Kael sprinting toward her, his wolf eyes wide with desperation, but he was cut off by a wall of fire ignited by the new attackers. The last thing she saw before the darkness took her was Silas being dragged away by the same men, and a voice whispered in her ear, a voice that sounded like static and death. "You were never meant to live this long, little son." The world went black, leaving the battlefield in a silent, snowy grave. The Alpha King's roar of agony was the only thing that remained, echoing through the empty mountain pass. Chapter 7. The Altar of Deceit. Cold iron bit into Naira's wrists, the metal chilled by the damp stone walls of a cell that smelled of stagnant water and ancient rot. Her head throbbed with the rhythmic pulse of the sedative still coursing through her veins, a thick purple fog that muffled her connection to her wolf. Because the moonblight had been shattered, her inner beast was no longer silent. She was a wounded predator pacing a cage of bone, snarling at the chemical chains holding her down. Why did the air feel so heavy, as if the very shadows were leaning in to suffocate her? A heavy oak door creaked open, admitting a sliver of torchlight that danced cruelly against the damp floor. 2 figures entered, their footsteps echoing with a synchronization that spoke of years of shared malice. Silas walked in front, his face still mapped with the red, blistering burns from Naira's awakening. Behind him stood a man draped in the heavy furs of a high elder, his eyes like polished flint. This was Malphus, the true architect of the Silver Blood Pack's secrets, the man who had signed the order to poison a child. "You look remarkably like your mother when she realized her fate," Malphus remarked, his voice a dry rasp that set Naira's teeth on edge. He leaned over her, his scent of mothballs and stale ozone clashing with the metallic tang of the room. She too thought her gifts made her untouchable. She was wrong. Power is only useful if you have the stomach to keep it. "You killed her," Naira croaked, her voice cracking like dry parchment. She struggled against the shackles, the silver-flecked iron searing her skin. "You didn't just suppress me. You erased my entire life because you were afraid of a little girl." Silas let out a jagged, mocking laugh, stepping forward to tilt her chin up with a bruised hand. "Afraid? No, Naira, we were being practical. A seer wolf who can't see the future is just a breeder. But now that Kael has jump-started your heart, you've become a liability, or a very valuable bargaining chip." "He's coming for you," Naira spat, a glob of blood-tinged saliva hitting Silas's cheek. "He gave up his throne once to find me in a crowded room. What do you think he'll do to this place when he finds out you have me?" Silas's expression darkened, his fingers tightening on her jaw until her teeth ground together. "That's the beauty of it. He won't find this place. This fortress is shielded by the very magic your ancestors used to hide from the world. To him, you've simply vanished into the mist. And while he's busy tearing the northern territories apart looking for a ghost, we'll be finalizing the deal with the Southern Coalition." The realization hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just about pack politics. It was a coup. By capturing her, they were baiting Kael into a reckless war that would leave his kingdom vulnerable to invasion. She was the lure, and Kael was the starving predator ready to snap at the hook. Her fear for herself vanished, replaced by a cold, sharp clarity. She had to get out, not just to save her life, but to save the man who had sacrificed his peace for her. "You're making a mistake," she whispered, her silver eyes beginning to glow faintly beneath the veil of the sedative. "You think you've trapped a wolf, but you've actually invited a storm into your house." Malphus ignored her, turning to Silas with a dismissive wave. "Prepare the ritual site. If we can't suppress her again, we'll harvest the marrow. The seer blood is worth more than the girl." As they left, the heavy door thudding shut with a finality that felt like a coffin lid, Naira closed her eyes. She reached deep into the center of her being, past the pain and the purple fog. She found the white light of her wolf, huddled and shivering but still burning. Since the moonblight was gone, there was no wall, only a wound. She whispered to the beast, promising her a feast of vengeance if she could only break the iron. The shadows in the corner of the cell began to twitch, responding to her rising pulse. She was no longer waiting to be saved. She was learning how to be the danger. Chapter 8. The Price of the Crown. The ritual chamber was a cathedral of bone and obsidian, situated at the very peak of the hidden fortress. Outside, the storm Kael had used for cover had turned into a full-scale blizzard, the wind screaming through the arrow slits like a chorus of the damned. Naira was strapped to a cold stone slab, her limbs spread eagle as hooded figures chanted in a language that tasted of copper and ash. She could feel the vibrations of the earth, a low, rhythmic thumping that told her Kael was close. He was hitting the outer walls, a force of nature fueled by a mating bond that had turned into a death pact. "He's here," she gasped, her lungs struggling against the leather straps. "I can feel him. He's burning through your guards like dry grass." Silas stood over her, a ceremonial dagger of obsidian raised high, his eyes reflecting the flickering blue flames of the braziers. "He can scream all he wants. By the time he breaks that door, you'll be a shell and your power will be ours. He chose a servant over a kingdom, Naira. He's already lost." "He chose me," she corrected, her voice rising above the chanting. "He didn't choose a servant or a queen, he chose a person. That's why you'll never understand him. That's why you've already lost." The massive stone doors of the chamber groaned, the sound of splintering wood and shattering bone echoing from the hallway. A roar so loud it rattled the jars of organs on the shelves tore through the air. Kael was no longer a man. He was a god of shadow and blood. He burst through the entrance, his fur matted with ice and gore, his golden eyes fixed on the slab where Naira lay. He didn't hesitate. He tore through the circle of hooded figures, his claws leaving trails of fire in the air. But Malphus stepped forward, holding a shimmering violet crystal that pulsed with a sickening light. "Stop, King! One more step and the feedback from this stone will liquefy her brain. You can have her life, or you can have your revenge. You cannot have both." Kael froze mid-lunge, his massive wolf form trembling with a suppressed violence that made the floor crack beneath his paws. He shifted back into his human form, standing naked and bloodied in the center of the room. He looked at Naira, and for the first time she saw the true depth of his fear. He wasn't afraid of death, he was afraid of a world without her. "Let her go," Kael said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that sounded like grinding stones. "Take the throne. Take the lands. I'll sign the abdication right now. Just let her live." "Kael, no!" Naira screamed, her heart breaking at the sight of him kneeling. "Don't give them what they want. I'm not worth the kingdom." "You are the only thing worth anything," he replied, his gaze never leaving hers. He looked at Malphus, his expression one of absolute, terrifying resolve. "The documents are in the carriage. My seal is with my beta. Take it all. Just move away from the slab." The betrayal from within his own ranks had left him with no cards to play. He was giving up centuries of lineage for a girl who had been serving punch a week ago. Malphus smirked, the greed in his eyes eclipsing his caution. He beckoned Silas to take the seal from Kael. But in that moment of triumph, the villains forgot one thing. Naira was no longer suppressed. The self-sacrifice Kael was making acted as the final catalyst. The bond between them flared with a brilliance that blinded everyone in the room. It wasn't a thread anymore. It was a bridge of pure, white-hot energy. Naira felt the white wolf inside her leap, not in fear, but in a predatory joy. The stone slab beneath her cracked as her power surged, shattering the leather straps and the silver iron shackles like they were made of wet straw. She stood up, her hair floating in the air, her skin glowing with the radiance of a dying star. She wasn't just a seer, she was the sun. Silas tried to lunge with the dagger, but she simply raised a hand, a wave of kinetic force slamming him into the obsidian wall with a sickening crunch. She turned her gaze to Malphus, the man who had stolen her childhood. "You wanted my power?" she asked, her voice sounding like the combined echoes of 1,000 ancestors. "Then have it all." Chapter 9. The Dawn of Choice. The explosion of light leveled the ritual chamber. the ancient obsidian stones turning to dust under the weight of Naira's released spirit. When the smoke cleared, the blizzard outside had calmed, replaced by a soft, eerie silence. Malphus lay in a heap, his mind shattered by the visions Naira had forced into his head, every second of the pain he had caused her, amplified 1,000-fold. Silas was gone, fled into the night like the coward he had always been. The fortress was a ruin, a tomb for the secrets of the Silver Blood Pack. Naira stood in the center of the debris, her white wolf form slowly receding back into her skin. She felt light, as if she had finally shed a skin made of lead. She looked down at her hands, which were steady for the first time in years. Since she had reclaimed her own destiny, the world looked different, vivid, sharp, and full of possibilities. She turned to find Kael, who was watching her from the shadows of a fallen pillar. He looked battered, his body a map of the hell he had walked through to find her. He wasn't the untouchable king anymore. He was just a man who had nearly lost everything. He didn't move toward her, his eyes filled with a sudden, heartbreaking uncertainty. He had seen what she was now. He had seen the goddess beneath the servant. "You don't have to stay," Kael said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "The bond, it's not a prison anymore. You're more powerful than any alpha. You could lead a dozen packs. You don't need a king to protect you." Naira walked toward him, her bare feet stepping over the rubble of her past. She stopped inches from him, the scent of cedar and rain still the only thing that made her feel safe. She reached out, her fingers tracing the jagged cut on his cheek. "You were going to give it all up," she murmured. "Your crown, your history, your power. Why?" "Because you are the only person who ever looked at me and saw the man, not the throne," Kael replied, his hand coming up to cover hers. "And because I've been waiting for you my entire life, even when I didn't know your name." Naira smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached her silver-flecked eyes. She realized then that the core emotional question had finally been answered. She wasn't chosen because she was convenient or because she was a mate. She was chosen because she was his equal. She wasn't being chosen second. She was being chosen as the only one. "I'm not a Luna because a ceremony says so," Naira said, her voice firm and clear. "And I'm not yours because the moon goddess tied a string between us. I'm here because I choose to be. And I choose you." She pulled him down into a kiss that tasted of salt, blood, and a future they would build together. It was a kiss that sealed more than a bond. It sealed a partnership. As they walked out of the ruins of the fortress, the first rays of dawn hit the mountain peaks, turning the snow into a sea of diamonds. The girl who had been rejected by fate had died in that ballroom. The woman who stood on the cliffside now was the architect of her own soul. Behind them, the old world of suppressed power and forced marriages lay in ashes. Ahead of them, a kingdom was waiting to be rebuilt, not by a king and his mate, but by two souls who had found their way home through the dark. Naira took Kael's hand, her grip strong and sure, and together they stepped into the light of a new day. The hunt was over. The rain had just begun. Chapter 10. The Crucible of the North. The iron-scented mist of the high peaks clung to Naira's skin, a cold reminder that while the fortress had fallen, the war was merely shifting shapes. They had returned to the northern stronghold, a sprawling castle of granite and glass that served as Kael's ancestral seat. Because the news of Kael's near abdication had traveled faster than their horses, the atmosphere in the great hall was thick with the suffocating stench of doubt. High-ranking alphas from the vassal pack stood in clusters, their hushed whispers cutting off like a physical blade the moment Naira stepped into the room. She was no longer wearing the thin cotton of a servant. She was draped in midnight blue velvet, the silver embroidery catching the light like a trapped constellation. Kael walked a step behind her, a deliberate subversion of traditional protocol that made the elder's eyes twitch with suppressed fury. He was signaling to the world that she wasn't his shadow. She was his center. His presence was a low-frequency hum of protective violence, his gaze daring anyone to breathe a word of dissent. Yet Naira could feel the cracks in his authority. Power in the werewolf world was a predatory thing. It sensed weakness and lunged. By choosing her over his throne in that ritual chamber, Kael had shown he had a heart, and to these men, a heart was a target. The Southern Coalition has moved 3 battalions to the border. Alpha Thorn, a man with shoulders like an ox and a voice like grinding gravel, announced without preamble. He didn't bow. He didn't even look at Naira. They claim the North is unstable. They claim the king has traded his crown for a broken mate. If we don't show strength, Kael, the pack will hunt its own leader. I am right here, Thorn, Naira said, her voice cutting through the heavy air with a clarity that startled the room. She stepped forward, the silver-white glow of her eyes flaring just enough to make the Alpha flinch. And I am not broken. I am the reason Malphus is currently a vegetable, and his fortress is a pile of ash. If you're looking for strength, stop looking at the king's crown and start looking at the woman standing in front of you. Thorn's lip curled into a sneer, his hand hovering over the hilt of his broadsword. A seer wolf is a myth until she proves she can bleed. You might have flashy lights, girl, but can you lead a hunt? Can you protect the borders when the Silver Bloods come to reclaim their property? She doesn't need to prove anything to you, Kael growled, his shadow lengthening across the floor as his wolf pushed against the surface. Naira is the Luna of the North. Her word is mine. If you have a problem with her pedigree, you can take it up with me in the pit. Naira put a hand on Kael's forearm, the heat of his skin grounding her. She didn't want him to fight her battles anymore. She needed to earn the respect of this pack on her own terms. She looked Thorn in the eye, her expression one of icy resolve. The Alpha is right about one thing, Kael. We need to show them what I am. Not as a mate, but as a weapon. The challenge was set. For the next 3 days, Kael transformed the training grounds into a gauntlet designed to break a god. He pushed Naira into the deep snow of the mountains, forcing her to track invisible scents while her vision was clouded by artificial mists. He sparred with her until her knuckles were raw and her lungs felt like they were filled with crushed glass. Since he knew her wolf was still adjusting to the loss of the moonblight, he didn't hold back. He attacked her with the speed and ferocity of a true predator, forcing her to rely on her instincts rather than her newly discovered magic. Stop trying to see the future and start feeling the present, Kael roared as he swept her legs out from under her for the 5th time that hour. He pinned her into the frozen mud, his weight a crushing pressure. If you rely on a vision, you're already dead. The future is fluid, Naira. The only thing that's real is the heart beating against mine. Move! Naira let out a frustrated scream, her wolf finally snapping. She didn't push him away with her hands. She let out a pulse of pure kinetic energy from her chest that sent Kael flying 10 feet back into a stone pillar. She scrambled to her feet, her hair a wild halo of dark silk, her eyes burning with a silver fire that turned the falling snow into steam. She didn't wait for him to recover. She lunged, her movements a blur of inhuman speed. They collided in a tangle of limbs and teeth, a brutal dance of dominance that slowly shifted into something else. The anger was there, but it was being fueled by a desperate electric attraction. Every time his skin touched hers, a spark of the bond arced between them, making their hair stand on end. Kael caught her wrists, pinning them against the pillar, his breath coming in ragged gasps that mingled with her own. Is that enough for you? She panted, her face inches from his. It's a start, Kael whispered, his golden eyes darkening with a hunger that had nothing to do with combat. He leaned in, his lips hovering just above hers, the world around them disappearing into a haze of adrenaline and desire. He touched her jaw with a tenderness that contradicted the violence of their training, his thumb tracing the line of her throat. Naira froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She wanted to let him in, to surrender to the warmth of his touch. But the old voice in the back of her mind, the one that whispered she was just a placeholder, made her flinch away. She couldn't let her heart soften while the blade was still at her neck. The moment was shattered by a sharp, piercing howl from the western watchtower. It wasn't a call for a hunt. It was a warning. Kael let go of her instantly, his face hardening into a mask of lethal efficiency. He didn't say a word as he sprinted toward the wall, Naira hot on his heels. As they reached the ramparts, they saw a single rider approaching the gates, draped in the tattered colors of the silver blood pack. The rider wasn't an assassin. It was a messenger, and in his hand, he held a box of polished black wood. He threw the box at the feet of the guards and turned his horse around, fleeing into the trees before a single arrow could be loosed. Kael climbed down to the courtyard, his movements stiff. He opened the box, and a collective gasp went up from the guards. Inside was a lock of hair, a silver ring Naira recognized instantly, and a note written in a hand she had seen in the archives. The blood you spilled was just the beginning. The moon is turning red, little son. We are coming to take back what was stolen. Naira felt the blood drain from her face. The ring belonged to her mother, the woman everyone said was dead. The past hadn't just been a lie. It was a cage that was still being built. She looked at Kael, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of doubt in his eyes. The stakes had just risen beyond a kingdom or a crown. They were playing for the souls of the living and the dead. Chapter 11. The Orchestrated Echo. The silence of the war room was heavier than the stones of the palace itself. Maps were spread across the central table, weighed down by daggers and silver coins. But no one was looking at the geography. Everyone was looking at the ring. It sat in the center of the table, a simple band of moonlight silver that seemed to pulse with a faint, dying energy. Because Naira could sense the residual trace of her mother's aura on the metal, she couldn't bring herself to touch it. It felt like a trap waiting to snap shut on her heart. "It's a trick," Alpha Thorn spat, pacing the perimeter of the room like a caged animal. "Malphus is a vegetable, Silas is a fugitive. Who is left to send messages? This is a ghost story designed to distract us from the southern border." "It's not a trick," Naira said, her voice small but absolute. She felt the gaze of every man in the room, but for the first time, she didn't shrink away. "I can feel her. It's faint, like a whisper in a storm, but my mother's essence is on this ring. She's alive, Thorn, and she's being used to lure me out." Kael leaned over the table, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the wood. If she's alive, she's been a prisoner for 15 years. Why show her now? Why wait until Naira has fully awakened? "Because an awakened seer is the only key to the Sun Gate," a new voice interrupted. The doors opened to admit Ilara, the archivist. She looked older than she had a few days ago, her skin like parchment stretched over bone. She walked to the table and tapped a spot on the map that remained blank, a region of the forbidden forest where no wolf dared to tread. "The Sun Gate isn't a myth, Kael. It's a literal bridge to the source of our magic. The Silver Bloods don't want Naira back to re-educate her. They want her to open the gate so they can drain the source and rule every pack from the north to the sea." "And my mother?" Naira asked, her voice trembling. "Your mother was the first attempt," Ilara said softly. Her eyes filled with a pity that made Naira's stomach churn. "She failed to open the gate because she wouldn't give her life for their greed. They've kept her in a state of living death, waiting for her bloodline to produce another who could finish what she started." The room erupted into chaos. The Alphas began arguing about troop movements and the risk of leaving the stronghold, but Naira heard none of it. She was looking at the map, at the blank spot where her mother was likely suffering. The midpoint shift was happening within her, the realization that her life had never been her own. She had been a project, a tool, a victim of an orchestration so vast it spanned generations. She felt a surge of rage so intense it physically hurt. She wasn't just unworthy, she had been systematically stripped of her worth so she would be easier to use. "I'm going," Naira said, her voice cutting through the shouting like a thunderclap. Kael turned to her, his expression a mix of terror and pride. "You won't go alone. We'll take the entire Northern Army." "No," Naira countered, stepping closer to him. "If you take an army, they'll kill her before we get through the gates. They want me, Kael. They want the little son. If I go in quiet, I have a chance to get her out before they realize I'm not coming to play their game. It's a suicide mission. Thorn laughed, though there was no humor in it. You're going to walk into the heart of the Silver Blood territory with nothing but a dagger and a prayer? I'm going with my wolf, Naira said, her eyes flaring silver. And I'm going with the man who would burn a kingdom for me. Is that enough for you, Thorn? The Alpha went silent, his gaze shifting to Kael. The king didn't look at his council. He looked at Naira, searching her face for the girl who had sat beside him on a dare. He didn't find her. He found a woman who was ready to face her demons and win. He nodded once, a gesture of absolute finality. We leave at midnight, Kael decreed. Just the two of us and a small scouting party. If we don't return by the third moon, Thorn, you take the crown. Keep the North safe. Later that night, as they prepared their gear in the silence of their private chambers, Naira felt the weight of the moment. She was standing at the point of no return. If they failed, her mother would die, Kael would lose his life, and the world would fall to the Silver Bloods. She looked at Kael, who was sharpening a silver-tipped spear, his movements steady and rhythmic. Kael, she whispered. He looked up, the candlelight reflecting in his golden eyes. Yeah. Why did you choose me? Really? He set the spear down and walked across the room, taking her face in his hands. His touch was the only thing that made the world feel real. Because when I looked into your eyes that first night, I didn't see a servant or a seer. I saw someone who was just as lonely as I was. I saw someone who was fighting a war no one else could see. I didn't choose you to save you, Naira. I chose you because I wanted to fight beside you. He kissed her then, a deep, desperate thing that tasted of goodbye and forever. Naira clung to him, her fingers digging into his shoulders. She realized then that she wasn't worthy because of her blood or her power. She was worthy because she was loved, and that love was going to be the fire that burned her enemies to ash. Chapter 12. The Whisper of the Woods. The Forbidden Forest was a place where the trees had eyes, and the wind carried the voices of the forgotten. It was a dense, suffocating canopy of black oak and silver-leafed briars that seemed to move when you weren't looking. Naira and Kael moved through the undergrowth like ghosts, their scents masked by a pungent herbal paste Alara had provided. The scouting party stayed a mile back, acting as a distraction to draw the perimeter guards away from the hidden path. Naira could feel the sun gate. It was a low, humming vibration in her marrow, a magnetic pull that grew stronger with every step. Her wolf was restless, her fur prickling under the invisible pressure of the ancient magic. Since they had entered the forest, the colors of the world had shifted. The shadows were a deep violet, and the moss glowed with a faint, sickly green light. It was a realm of illusions and traps, designed to break the mind before the body. Stay close, Kael whispered, his hand never leaving his weapon. The trees here feed on fear. If you hear someone calling your name, don't look back. I hear her, Naira replied, her voice barely a breath. She's not calling my name. She's screaming. The sound wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from the earth itself. Naira knelt down, pressing her palm against the cold, damp soil. She saw a flash of a woman with her own eyes chained to a wall of crystal, her veins glowing with a pulsing purple light. It was a vision of the present, a real-time anchor to her mother's suffering. The sun gate wasn't just a bridge, it was a siphon. They were using her mother as a battery to keep the gate cracked open until Naira arrived to provide the full charge. We're close, Naira said, standing up with a newfound ferocity. The entrance is behind that waterfall of black water. They stepped through the liquid shadow, the cold biting through their furs. On the other side was a cavern of white quartz, lit by the glowing veins of the mountain itself. In the center of the cavern stood a woman, suspended in the air by chains of solid light. Her hair was a tangled mess of silver and gray, her skin so pale it was almost translucent. Mother, Naira breathed, stepping forward. The woman's eyes snapped open, a brilliant, terrifying silver. Run, child, it's a trap. He's not here for the gate, he's here for the bond. Before Naira could react, a figure stepped out from the shadows of a quartz pillar. It wasn't Silas. It wasn't Malphus. It was a man she had seen only in the most prestigious portraits of the High Council. It was the Grand Alpha of the Southern Coalition, the man everyone thought was Kael's greatest ally. A mating bond between an Alpha King and a seer wolf is the most powerful source of energy in this world, the Grand Alpha said, his voice smooth as silk. I don't need the Sun Gate to rule. I just need to kill one of you while the bond is at its peak. The emotional backlash will ripple through the north and leave it ripe for the taking. He gestured with his hand, and a dozen elite warriors emerged from the quartz walls, their weapons tipped with the same purple sedative that had taken Naira down before. Kael moved instantly, his wolf form emerging in a burst of black shadow, but the cavern was small, and the enemies were everywhere. You chose love over power, Kael. The Grand Alpha laughed, his eyes glowing with a cold, calculating light. That was your first mistake. Your second was bringing her here. Naira felt the cage closing in. She looked at her mother, at Kael fighting for his life, and at the man who had orchestrated the destruction of her entire lineage. The internal belief system she had lived with, that she was a victim of fate, finally shattered for good. She wasn't a victim. She was the one who decided how this story ended. She felt the white light of her wolf roar to life, not as a scream, but as a command. You want my power? Naira shouted, the cavern shaking as she channeled every ounce of the Sun Gate's energy through her own body. Then take it. All of it. The white light exploded outward, not as a flash, but as a solid wall of heat that vaporized the purple sedative and sent the Grand Alpha flying backward. The quartz walls began to sing, the vibration so intense it shattered the chains holding her mother. Naira caught her as she fell, her silver eyes meeting her mother's for the first time in 15 years. I've got you, Naira whispered. But as she looked up, she saw Kael pinned against a wall of light, a jagged blade of obsidian hovering over his heart. The Grand Alpha was smiling, blood dripping from his mouth. One of you has to die for the backlash to work, Naira. Choose. The cliffhanger hung in the air, heavy and jagged. Naira was no longer the girl who was unchosen. She was the one who held the blade of fate in her hand, and she was about to show them what happens when a wolf finally stops running. Chapter 13. The Radiance of Ruin. The cavern of white quartz became a pressure cooker of ancient magic and raw, agonizing choice. The Grand Alpha's obsidian blade hovered inches from Kael's throat, the dark stone drinking in the light of the Sun Gate like a thirsty shadow. Because the mating bond was a living circuit between them, Naira could feel Kael's heartbeat stuttering against the back of her own ribs, a frantic, rhythmic drumming that signaled the end of his endurance. She stood in the center of the vibrating chamber, cradling her mother's frail, shivering form against her chest. Why did the universe demand a sacrifice from those who had already given everything? Release him, Naira commanded, her voice no longer human but a harmonic resonance that cracked the surrounding crystals. The Grand Alpha laughed, a jagged sound that scraped against the walls. The bond requires a death to trigger the surge, little son. If I kill the king, the North falls into madness and I step into the vacuum. If you die, he becomes a mindless beast I can put down like a rabid dog. Either way, the board is cleared. Kael looked at her then, his golden eyes blown wide with a desperate, silent plea. He wasn't asking her to save him, he was telling her to run. He was offering his life as a shield one last time, a final act of devotion from a man who had traded his crown for her smile. Since he was pinned by the wall of light, his muscles were locked in a static scream of effort, his skin blistering under the intensity of the Southern Alpha's sorcery. Naira felt the white-hot fury of her wolf clawing at her throat, demanding to be let off the leash. You think you understand the bond because you've read the scrolls? Naira spat, her silver eyes flaring with an intensity that forced the Grand Alpha to squint. She gently lowered her mother to the soft moss and stood up, her hair swirling around her like a storm of dark silk. But you've never felt it. You've never felt the way it doesn't just connect two people. It merges them, You want a sacrifice? I'll give you a transformation. She didn't lunge at the alpha. Instead, she reached inward, deeper than she had ever dared to go, touching the very core of the sun gate's resonance. She didn't try to fight the magic. She became the conduit for it. The quartz beneath her feet turned translucent as she channeled the mountain's power through her veins, her blood singing with a frequency that shattered the obsidian blade in the Grand Alpha's hand. The backlash was instantaneous. A wave of kinetic force threw the southern warriors against the jagged walls, their weapons melting into useless puddles of silver. Naira walked toward Kael, the light coming from her skin so bright it erased the shadows of the cave. She reached out and touched the wall of light holding him captive, her fingers sinking into the energy as if it were warm water. With a sharp, decisive tug, she tore the barrier apart, catching Kael as he collapsed into her arms. "I've got you," she whispered, her voice a soothing balm against the roar of the collapsing cavern. Kael gripped her shoulders, his touch searing and real. "Naira, your eyes, they're not just silver anymore." She didn't look in a mirror to know he was right. She could see the threads of the future weaving together in front of her, a tapestry of gold and shadow. She saw the Grand Alpha scrambling for a fallen dagger, his face a mask of ruined ambition. She didn't wait for him to strike. She raised her hand, and the very air in the cavern solidified around him, pinning him to the floor with the weight of 1,000 years of history. "You spent 15 years trying to control this power," Naira said, standing over him like an avenging goddess. "But you forgot that the sun doesn't just give life. It burns." The point of no return had been crossed. She wasn't the girl who had been rejected by a common soldier anymore. She was the woman who had brought a high alpha to his knees without breaking a sweat. As the cavern began to groan, the ceiling raining down shards of white quartz, Naira realized that her mother's prophecy was coming true. The moonblight was gone, the secrets were out, and the only thing left was the fire. Chapter 14. The Return of the Prodigal. The journey back to the northern stronghold was a procession of ghosts and glory. Word had spread through the forest like wildfire. The little sun had awakened, the Grand Alpha had fallen, and the Queen of the North was bringing her mother home. Because the scouting party had secured the perimeter, the ride was uncontested, but the silence of the woods felt different now. It was a respectful silence, the trees bowing under the weight of a power they hadn't felt in generations. Naira rode at the head of the column, her mother wrapped in Kael's heavy furs, the older woman's eyes finally beginning to lose their haunted glaze. Kael rode beside her, his gaze never straying far from her profile. He looked like a man who had seen a miracle and was still trying to find the words to describe it. The power imbalance that had once defined their relationship was gone, replaced by a terrifyingly beautiful equality. He wasn't her protector anymore, he was her partner. And as they approached the massive granite gates of the stronghold, Naira could see the entire pack waiting for them. Alpha Thorn stood at the front of the crowd, his broadsword sheathed, his head bowed. Behind him, the council members who had whispered about her unworthiness were silent, their eyes filled with a mix of awe and genuine fear. They didn't see a servant in velvet. They saw the woman who had survived the forbidden forest and come back with the sun in her eyes. "The gates are open, Luna," Thorn announced, his voice booming across the courtyard. He stepped aside, clearing the path for their horses. "The North recognizes its queen." Naira didn't stop to celebrate. She led her mother directly to the healer's wing, staying by her side as the ancient wolf began the long process of recovery. For hours, she sat in the dim light of the infirmary, the scent of lavender and dried herbs grounding her. Her mother's hand was small and fragile in hers, a physical link to a past she was finally starting to understand. "You have his eyes," her mother whispered, her voice a thin thread in the quiet room. "Your father. He fought for the gate, too. He died so I could keep the secret of your birth hidden from Malphus for just one more day." "I know, Mother," Naira replied, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "I know everything now. The lies are over." Later that evening, Naira found Kael on the high battlements, looking out over the frozen tundra. The moon was a sliver of ice in the black sky, but the air felt charged with a new energy. She walked up behind him, the silk of her skirts rustling against the stone. He didn't turn around, but she felt his heart rate accelerate through the bond. A familiar, comforting rhythm that made her smile. "They're calling you the White Wolf," Kael said, his voice carrying a hint of a laugh. "The elders are already drafting the new scrolls. They want to know when the coronation ceremony will be." "I don't need a ceremony to know who I am, Kael," Naira said, stepping up to the stone railing beside him. She looked out at the vast, beautiful kingdom they had nearly lost. "But I do need to know one thing." He turned to her, his golden eyes reflecting the starlight. "Anything." "The Grand Alpha said you chose love over power. He said it was your mistake. Do you regret it? Now that you know what I am, do you wish I was just the quiet girl from the ballroom who wouldn't challenge your throne?" Kael took her hands in his grip firm and warm. "I chose you when you were a servant in a stained apron, Naira. I chose you when you were a ghost who thought she was broken. The power, that's just the world finally seeing what I saw from the start. I don't regret a single second of the fire we walked through to get here." The moment was interrupted by a shadow moving across the courtyard below. It was a messenger, but not from the south. The man was wearing the colors of the Western tribes, and he looked like he had been riding for days without sleep. He collapsed at the feet of the guards, gasping for breath as he pointed toward the horizon. "The Silver Bloods!" he shouted, his voice cracking with terror. "They didn't flee. Silas. He's gathered the remnants of the southern battalions. They're not coming for the gate anymore. They're coming to burn the stronghold to the ground while the moon is high." Naira felt the surge of adrenaline hit her system, but it wasn't the panic of the past. It was the calm, icy focus of a predator. She looked at Kael, and she saw the same fire in his eyes. The rising stakes had reached their peak. This wasn't just a skirmish or a rescue mission. This was the final battle for the soul of the North. Chapter 15. The Apex of the Storm. The air tasted of ozone and impending snow as the Silver Blood Army crested the final ridge. There were hundreds of them, a sea of dark fur and gleaming steel that stretched across the valley. Silas rode at the front, his face a twisted mask of scars and desperation. He had nothing left to lose, which made him the most dangerous kind of enemy. He wasn't fighting for a throne. He was fighting to erase the shame of his own failure. Inside the stronghold, the atmosphere was one of grim determination. The northern warriors were ready, their claws extended, and their eyes glowing with a feral intensity. Because Naira was standing on the battlements, her white fur shimmering under the moonlight, the men felt a courage they hadn't known since the age of heroes. She was their North Star, a literal beacon of power that promised victory at any cost. "They think our numbers are low," Kael said, standing beside her in his massive black wolf form. His voice rumbled through the bond, a low-frequency vibration that made Naira's skin tingle. "They don't realize that one seer wolf is worth 1,000 soldiers." "I'm not just going to watch, Kael," Naira replied, her silver eyes scanning the enemy lines. She saw the weak points in their formation, the threads of the future flickering in front of her. "I'm going to lead the charge." As the first wave of Silver Bloods reached the gates, Naira didn't wait for them to break through. She leapt from the battlements, her white wolf form emerging mid-air like a burst of starlight. She hit the ground with a force that sent a shockwave through the front lines, clearing a path for Kael and the northern elite. The battle was a chaotic symphony of violence, the wet crunch of bone, the metallic tang of blood, and the terrifying howls of dying men. Naira moved like a ghost through the fray, her movements a blur of inhuman speed. She wasn't just fighting, she was orchestrating. Every time a Silver Blood lunged, she was already gone, her claws finding their mark with a surgical precision. She could see their movements before they made them, her gift allowing her to dance between the blades. She found Silas in the center of the carnage, his eyes wide with a frantic, animalistic fear. "You should have stayed in the shadows, Silas," Naira roared, her voice echoing through the valley. He lunged at her, his desperation lending him a momentary strength, but he was no match for a woman who had embraced her own destiny. Naira caught his throat in her jaws, her teeth sinking into the flesh with a satisfying finality. She didn't kill him instantly. She let him see the light in her eyes, let him feel the power of the woman he had tried to break. With one decisive snap, the man who had started her journey of rejection was gone. The Silver Blood Army collapsed almost instantly after their leader fell. They weren't fighting for a cause. They were fighting for a ghost. As the remaining soldiers fled into the darkness, the northern warriors let out a howl of victory that shook the mountains. Naira stood in the center of the battlefield, her white fur stained with the blood of her enemies, her breath coming in heavy, ragged plumes of steam. Kael walked up to her, his black fur matted and torn, his eyes filled with a pride that was almost blinding. He shifted back into his human form and took her face in his hands, his touch the only thing that could calm the storm inside her. "It's over," he whispered. Naira shifted back, her skin glowing softly in the aftermath of the battle. She looked around at the ruin and the glory, at the men who were finally looking at her with love instead of fear. She wasn't a servant. She wasn't a placeholder. She was the queen who had chosen her own crown. "No," Naira said, leaning into his touch as the first light of a new dawn began to break over the horizon. "It's just beginning." The final resolution wasn't found in a throne room or a crown. It was found in the way they walked back into the stronghold, hand in hand, equals in every sense of the word. The girl who was once rejected by fate had become the woman who decided her own destiny, and the kingdom she had built was going to be a light that never went out. Chapter 16. The Fracture of Trust. The victory over Silas felt like a shallow breath in a room filling with smoke. While the courtyard of the northern stronghold was still slick with the dark evidence of the skirmish, the air didn't taste like triumph. It tasted like ozone and static. Because the mating bond was supposed to be a tether of absolute clarity, the sudden jagged wall Naira felt rising between her and Kael was a physical blow to her sternum. She stood on the blood-stained ramparts, her white fur receding into human skin that felt too tight, too cold. Why was he pulling away now, when the world was finally at their feet? Kael stood 20 paces away, his back a rigid line of scarred muscle. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the horizon where the last of the southern battalions had vanished into the gray mist. His shadow stretched long and distorted across the stone, a dark finger pointing toward a future he seemed suddenly terrified to share. Naira stepped toward him, her bare feet silent on the grit, but the bond flickered, a guttering candle in a gale. "Kael?" she whispered, the name catching on the raw edges of her throat. He didn't turn. "You saw it, didn't you? During the fight. The way the magic didn't just come from you. It came from the gate. You weren't just fighting Silas. You were channeling something that shouldn't belong to one person." "I was protecting our pack," Naira countered, her voice hardening as the old insecurity flared. "I was protecting you. Since when is my power a problem for the king who claimed he wanted a partner?" "It's not a problem of power, Naira," he said, finally turning. His golden eyes were dim, clouded by a calculation she didn't recognize. "It's a problem of cost. The Grand Alpha was right about one thing. The backlash of a bond this strong. It's a beacon. Every rogue, every dying pack, every power-hungry elder is going to come for us. Not for the North. For you." The all-seems-lost moment didn't start with a blade. It started with the look of pity in his eyes. He wasn't looking at his queen. He was looking at a liability. Before she could bridge the distance, a frantic shout erupted from the inner sanctum. It was the High Healer, her face ashen, her hands trembling as she clutched a shredded piece of parchment. "The Queen Mother," the healer gasped, her voice cracking. "She's gone. The infirmary guards. They didn't even shift. They were dead before they hit the floor. Naira felt the world tilt. Her mother, the woman she had just pulled from the brink of a 15-year nightmare, had been snatched from the heart of the stronghold. But the betrayal cut deeper. As she looked at the dead guards, she saw the marks on their throats. Not claw marks, but the precise surgical punctures of Northern elite daggers. Someone close, someone she trusted to guard her soul, had opened the door. Chapter 17. The Judas Kiss. The investigation was a frantic, blurred nightmare. Naira moved through the palace like a ghost, her silver eyes scanning every face for a flicker of guilt. She felt a rising, suffocating dread. The betrayal revealed wasn't a sudden explosion. It was a slow-motion car crash. She found herself in the solar of Alpha Thorn, the man who had supposedly pledged his life to her cause. He was sitting at his desk, a glass of dark amber liquid in his hand, looking remarkably calm for a man whose queen had just been abducted. "Where is she, Thorn?" Naira asked, the shadows in the room beginning to swirl around her ankles. Thorn didn't look up. "She was never meant to live this long, Naira, you know that. A seer wolf of her generation, she knows too many of the old blood debts. My father didn't die for a kingdom. He died because your mother saw a future where his line ended. I'm just making sure the prophecy doesn't come true. You sold her back to them," Naira breathed, the realization a poison in her veins. "After everything we did. After Kael gave up his status for me." "Kael didn't give up anything," Thorn sneered, finally meeting her gaze. "He orchestrated the rescue to tether you to him. He knew that if you felt indebted, you'd never leave. He's been playing the long game since the night he saw you in that ballroom. Why do you think a king was sitting alone waiting for an Omega to take a dare?" The seeds of doubt, planted by the Grand Alpha and watered by Kael's recent distance, suddenly bloomed into a forest of thorns. Naira felt the bond snap. It didn't just break, it shattered, leaving a gaping, bleeding hole in her chest. She didn't stay to hear Thorn's excuses. She ran. She ran until her lungs burned, looking for the one person who could tell her the truth. She found Kael in the tactical room, staring at a map of the western reaches. He looked up, his expression one of haunted exhaustion. But Naira saw only the lie. She saw the king who had chosen her because she was a strategic asset, not a woman. "Is it true?" she demanded, her voice a jagged blade. "Did you know Thorn was moving her? Did you let them take her to keep me here?" "Naira, listen to me," Kael started, reaching for her. "Don't touch me," she screamed, a pulse of white light throwing him back against the table. "You were never the hero, were you? You were just the one who held the leash." In her grief and fury, she didn't see the shadow behind her. She didn't hear the whisper of the dart. The point of no return had become a trap. As the purple sedative hit her vein for the third time, the last thing she saw was Kael's face. Not a mask of triumph, but a portrait of absolute, soul-crushing despair. Chapter 18. The King's Ransom. Naira woke up in a place that wasn't a cell, but a sacrificial altar. She was deep in the bowels of the Western Ridge, surrounded by the remnants of the Southern Coalition and Thorn's treacherous elite. Her mother was there too, chained to a pillar of obsidian that pulsed with a dark, rhythmic light. The Grand Alpha, scarred, broken, but still breathing, stood over them with a ceremonial blade that hummed with the frequency of the sun gate. "You were right about one thing, little son," the Grand Alpha rasped, his voice a ghost of its former power. "The bond is a circuit, and every circuit needs a ground." A heavy thud echoed through the chamber. The heavy iron doors groaned as Kael entered. He wasn't shifted. He was walking alone, his hands empty, his crown left in the dirt outside. He looked at Naira, and for a fleeting second, the bond flickered back to life. In that one look, she saw the truth Thorn had tried to bury. Kael hadn't betrayed her. He had been trying to find a way to save her without the world burning, and his hesitation had been his undoing. "I'm here," Kael said, his voice echoing with a finality that made Naira's heart stop. Let them go. You wanted a sacrifice to trigger the backlash? You wanted the blood of an alpha king to fuel your gate? Take me. Leave the women. The Grand Alpha smiled, a slow, predatory expression. A fair trade, the king for the seer. But there's a catch, Kael. For the energy to be pure, the seer has to watch you die. She has to feel the bond break in real time. That's the only way the surge is strong enough to open the gate. No! Naira screamed, her voice echoing off the cold stone. Kael, don't! Let the gate stay closed! Let me die instead! Kael stepped onto the altar, his gaze fixed on hers. He didn't look like a king. He looked like a man who had finally found his purpose. He knelt before the Grand Alpha, baring his throat to the obsidian blade. I won't be chosen second again, Naira, he whispered, throwing her own words back at her with a heartbreaking smile. Because in this life and the next, you were always my first. As the blade descended, Naira felt the world go silent. Her deepest fear, being abandoned, being unchosen, was happening. But it was wrapped in a love so total it was terrifying. She watched the man she loved give up everything, not for a kingdom, but for her breath. The obsidian bit into his skin. The light in the room turned a blinding, screaming violet. The all-is-lost moment was complete. Kael fell, and as the bond in Naira's chest finally went dark, the white wolf within her didn't just howl. She began to burn the world down from the inside out. Chapter 19. The Ash of the Covenant. The silence that followed the fall of the king was not a lack of sound, but a void that sucked the oxygen from the chamber. As Kael's body hit the cold obsidian, the golden thread that had anchored Naira's soul for weeks didn't just snap. It evaporated, leaving a cauterized wound where her heart used to beat. Because the mating bond was a biological circuit, the sudden disconnection sent a physical shockwave through her nervous system, a jagged lightning strike that turned her vision into a wash of static. Why was the world still turning when the sun had been extinguished? The Grand Alpha stood over Kael's slumped form, his fingers trembling as he gripped the blood-slicked obsidian blade. He looked like a man who had finally touched the face of God and found it terrifying. The violet light in the room pulsed with a rhythmic, sickening throb, feeding on the dying resonance of the king's life force. Above them, the sun gate groaned, the ancient stone gears of the universe grinding together as they prepared to swing wide for a master they never wanted. It's done, the Grand Alpha rasped, his voice sounding thin and brittle against the rising hum of the mountain. The backlash is building. The gate is hungry, Naira. Can you feel it? The power of 1,000 years is pouring into this room, and all it cost was one man who loved too much. Naira didn't scream. She didn't weep. She sat on the cold floor, her mother's hand limp in hers, and watched the violet light dance in Kael's unmoving eyes. The all-seems-lost moment had reached its absolute nadir, and in that vacuum a cold, crystalline clarity began to form. She looked at the Grand Alpha, then at the treacherous warriors of the northern elite who stood by the doors, their faces masks of pale regret. They thought they had won a kingdom, but they had only succeeded in creating a monster. You think he died for the gate, Naira said, her voice a low, terrifying whisper that seemed to come from the stones themselves. She stood up slowly, her movements fluid and predatory. The purple sedative in her veins was being incinerated by a sudden, internal furnace. The moonblight had been a chemical cage, but the grief she felt now was a nuclear meltdown. She looked at Kael one last time, and in the frozen stillness of his features, she saw the truth of his sacrifice. He hadn't knelt because he was defeated. He had knelt because he knew that his death was the only thing that could truly set her wolf free. He had given her the ultimate gift, the choice to be the person she was meant to be, without the shadow of a throne. He didn't die for your power, Naira continued, her silver eyes beginning to bleed into a blinding, incandescent white. He died because he knew I would be the one to finish you. He chose me, knowing I would be the one to survive. The white light didn't just flicker this time. It erupted. It wasn't a pulse or a wave. It was a pillar of celestial fire that reached from the floor of the altar to the very apex of the sun gate. The violet energy was consumed instantly, swallowed by a purity that tasted of ozone and ancient justice. Naira's wolf didn't just emerge, she ascended. She was no longer a creature of flesh and fur, but a manifestation of the sun itself, her presence so bright that the Grand Alpha screamed, his skin blistering as he tried to shield his eyes. Chapter 20. The Architect of Choice. The transformation was a violent, beautiful rebirth. Naira felt every bone in her body shatter and reform in a split second, her human consciousness merging with the primal, starlit intellect of the seer wolf. Since she was now a direct conduit for the sun gate, the open loops of her life were finally closing. She saw the threads of fate clearly now, not as inevitable traps, but as paths she could walk or burn. She saw the Grand Alpha's fear, a jagged, dark blotch in the tapestry. She saw Thorn's betrayal, a weak, fraying string that was already snapping. "Enough," Naira commanded, the word a physical blow that sent the Grand Alpha flying backward into the obsidian pillar. She turned to her mother, her white light shielding the older woman from the debris of the collapsing chamber. With a thought, the light chains shattered, the crystal shards dissolving into dust. Her mother looked up, her silver eyes reflecting the goddess her daughter had become. "Naira, you did it. You broke the cycle." "I'm not the girl they broke, Mother," Naira said, her voice a chorus of 1,000 wolves. "And I'm not the queen they expected." She turned her attention back to the battlefield. Through the thick stone walls, she could feel the northern warriors outside, their spirits flagging as they felt the king's bond go dark. They were leaderless, surrounded by the remnants of the southern coalition waiting for a death that seemed certain. Naira didn't wait for a command. She reached out with her mind, touching every northern wolf on the ridge, her presence a warm golden sunrise in the middle of their darkest night. "Rise," she whispered into their hearts. "The king has fallen, but the sun has risen. Fight for the home he built. Fight for the future he bought." The response was an explosion of howling that shook the mountain to its roots. The northern wolves, fueled by her radiance, turned on their attackers with a ferocity that bordered on madness. Inside the chamber, the Grand Alpha scrambled to his feet, his face a ruin of scorched flesh. He lunged for the obsidian blade, his movements desperate and clumsy. "You can't change it," he shrieked. "The ritual is complete. The gate is open." "The gate is mine," Naira countered. She raised her hand, and the sun gate didn't just open, it reversed. The energy that had been siphoned from her mother and Kael began to pour back into the room, but it was filtered through Naira's soul. It was no longer a weapon of conquest. It was a tool of restoration. She directed the flow of light toward Kael's body, her heart screaming for one last miracle. She knew the rules of their world. Death was final, especially for an alpha. But she was the one who decided the rules now. "Come back," she pleaded, the white light wrapping around Kael's heart like a protective shroud. "I won't be chosen second again, and I won't let you leave me first." The tension in the room was a physical weight, the air humming with the impossible. The Grand Alpha watched in horror as the blood on the obsidian floor began to glow, flowing backward into the king's veins. The violet shadow that had claimed Kael was being incinerated by Naira's love. It was a gamble that defied every law of nature, a first hint of trouble that had evolved into a cosmic rewrite. Chapter 21. The Battlefield of Rebirth. The stone doors of the ritual chamber didn't open. They were vaporized by the sheer pressure of the light within. Naira emerged from the dust like a storm made of starlight, her white wolf form towering over the terrified soldiers in the hallway. She wasn't running from the fight anymore. She was the fight. Every step she took left a scorched footprint on the floor, the air around her vibrating with the power of the sun gate. She reached the battlefield on the ridge just as the first light of dawn hit the snow. The scene was a chaotic masterpiece of blood and bravery. The northern wolves were winning, their movements synchronized by the golden thread Naira had rewoven between them. Thorn was there, his broadsword broken, his eyes wide with a realization that his treachery was about to be met with a divine reckoning. "Naira!" Thorn shouted, trying to rally the few loyalists he had left. "You're a monster! You've brought the end of the world!" "I've brought the end of your world, Thorn," Naira replied, her voice a thunderclap that echoed through the valley. She didn't need a blade. She simply released a pulse of the Sun Gate's energy, a wave of heat that stripped the weapons from the hands of the traitors. They fell to their knees, not because she forced them, but because they couldn't stand in the presence of her truth. She saw the silver blood remnants flee into the trees, their fear a stench that poisoned the wind. She let them go. They were no longer the enemy. The only enemy left was the lie that she was weak. She turned her head as a low, familiar rumble echoed from the entrance of the fortress. A massive black wolf emerged from the shadows, his fur matted with dried blood, his golden eyes burning with a life that should have been extinguished. Kael had returned from the dark, his spirit pulled back by the thread Naira had refused to let go. He didn't look like a king who had been rescued. He looked like a man who had been reborn in the fire of his own devotion. He walked up to her, his movement steady and purposeful. He shifted back into his human form, his skin scarred but warm, his breath a visible plume of life in the cold air. He didn't say a word. He simply took her face in his hands, his touch a confirmation that the miracle had held. "You saved me," he whispered, his voice a hoarse, beautiful sound. "I saved us," Naira corrected, her white light softening as she returned to her human form. "I chose you, Kael, in the dark and in the light. Now let's show them what happens when the sun finally takes its throne." The northern warriors gathered around them, a sea of heads bowed in a respect that was no longer born of fear, but of love. The final push was over. The traitors were in chains, the enemies were scattered, and the two souls who had been broken by fate were finally standing in the sun. Naira looked at Kael, and she saw the future she had seen in the quartz cavern, a future they would build on their own terms. The girl who was invisible was gone. The woman who decided her own destiny was here, and the kingdom she led was finally going to be whole. As the sun rose over the ridge, painting the snow in shades of gold and rose, Naira took Kael's hand, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't waiting for the next rejection. She was waiting for the first day of the rest of her life. Chapter 22. The Purge of the Old Blood. The morning after the Sun Gate's closure didn't bring the soft peace of a lullaby. It brought the sharp, cold clarity of an executioner's blade. Snow fell in heavy, silent flakes, attempting to shroud the blackened earth where the Southern Coalition had made its final stand. Naira stood on the high balcony of the northern stronghold, her fingers gripping the stone railing until the granite groaned under the residual strength of her shift. Because the moonblight was a phantom of the past, her senses were now dialed to a predatory frequency that made the very air vibrate. She could hear the rhythmic thud of the dungeon doors 3 levels below, a heartbeat of justice for the men who had traded her mother's life for a scrap of power. Kael emerged from the shadow of the archway, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He had traded his battle-torn furs for a tunic of charcoal wool, though the scent of ozone and ancient fire still clung to his skin like a second soul. He didn't approach her with the cautious hesitation of their early days. He walked until his chest brushed her shoulder, his presence a warm, solid mountain that shielded her from the biting wind. The bond between them had changed. It was no longer a frantic, fragile thread, but a deep, resonant hum that synchronized their breathing without a single word. "Thorn and the others are being moved to the Iron Peaks at sunset," Kael said, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through Naira's marrow. "The council tried to argue for a trial, but your mother's testimony silenced them. They didn't just betray a king, they attempted to lobotomize a lineage. The pack won't let that stand." "A trial is for men who follow rules, Kael," Naira replied, her eyes flashing a brilliant sudden silver. "Thorn followed greed. He thought my mother was a battery and I was a trophy. He didn't realize that when you starve a wolf for 15 years, she doesn't come out looking for a compromise. She comes out looking for a throat. Kael took her hand, his thumb tracing the jagged scar on her palm where the silver shackles had once bitten deep. Is that what you're looking for? Vengeance? No, Naira whispered, turning to face him. I'm looking for a foundation. We can't build a new kingdom on top of a graveyard of secrets. If we don't pull the rot out by the roots, the Sun Gate will just become another prize for the next monster to chase. I'm tired of being the prize, Kael. The moment of internal conflict wasn't about her power, but about her humanity. She felt the goddess within her pushing for a total scorched earth reset, while the girl who had once cleared wine glasses pleaded for mercy. She looked at the courtyard where the northern warriors were scrubbing the blood from the stones. They looked at her with a reverence that felt like a weight. She wasn't their little ghost girl anymore. She was the white wolf, the seer who had stared into the sun and didn't blink. Chapter 23. The Sovereign's Choice. The great hall was packed with the scent of wet fur, expensive leather, and a palpable, electric tension. Every alpha from the surrounding territories had traveled through the blizzard to witness the transition. They sat at the long oak tables, their eyes darting between Kael and Naira as if trying to determine where the true power resided. Because the ritual in the quartz cavern had been felt by every shifter within 100 miles, the mystery of Naira's Omega status had been incinerated. They knew what she was. They just didn't know what she would do with them. Naira sat in the chair to Kael's right, her posture as straight as a spear. She didn't wear a crown. She wore her authority in the way the shadows seemed to retreat from her light. Her mother sat on her other side, looking frail but regal in robes of ivory silk. The room went silent as Naira stood up, the movement so fluid it seemed to stop the very ticking of the clocks. You came here to see if the North is weak, Naira began, her voice carrying to the rafters without effort. You came to see if the king's mate is a liability. Since you are all students of history, you know that a seer wolf has not walked these halls in 3 centuries. You know that my blood was suppressed by men you called allies. You know that the Southern Coalition was built on the theft of my family's magic. A low murmur broke out among the Western alphas, but Naira silenced them with a single, sharp look that made the candles flare into white pillars of flame. The age of secrets is over, she continued, her gaze sweeping the room. The Sun Gate will remain closed, not because we lack the keys, but because the North no longer needs a bridge to the gods. We have our own fire. If you wish to trade, to hunt, and to live in peace, our gates are open. But if you come for our blood, or if you attempt to suppress the gifts of the children in your own packs, I will find you. And you will find that the sun has a very long reach. Kael stood beside her, his hand resting on the hilt of his ceremonial sword. The Queen speaks for the North. Her decree is the law of the land. Anyone who disagrees can step into the circle now. No one moved. The climax of authority was total. The alphas bowed one by one, their foreheads touching the tables in a gesture of submission that hadn't been seen since the first king took the throne. Naira felt a strange, hollow sense of completion. She had won the room, she had won the pack, and she had won her life back. But as she looked at Kael, she saw a flicker of something in his eyes, a question that hadn't been answered by a speech or a decree. Later that night, the two of them walked through the silent halls of the palace toward the high gardens. The blizzard had passed, leaving the world under a blanket of pristine, sparkling white. The air was so cold it hurt to breathe, but Naira felt a warmth in her chest that had nothing to do with the temperature. She felt Kael's hand slip into hers, his grip firm and grounding. You were incredible today, Kael said, stopping by a fountain that had frozen into a sculpture of jagged ice. You didn't just lead them. You redefined what it means to be a Luna. They don't fear you because you're a mate. They fear you because you're a leader. Is that what you wanted? Naira asked, leaning her head against his shoulder. A leader? I wanted the girl who sat next to me on a dare, Kael replied, turning her to face him. The goddess is just a bonus. But Naira, there's a rumor coming from the eastern coast. They say Silas didn't die in the valley. They say he was taken by the Seawalkers before your light could finish him. Naira felt a chill that had nothing to do with the wind. The open loop of her past was refusing to close. She looked out at the dark tree line, the silver in her eyes reflecting the distant moon. She wasn't afraid. She had died and come back. She had lost a king and found him again. If Silas was alive, he was just a shadow waiting for the sunrise. Chapter 24. The Horizon of the Heart. The final dawn of the week broke over the peaks in a riot of gold and crimson. Naira stood at the edge of the cliff where she had once contemplated jumping to escape her life of service. Now, she stood there with the weight of a kingdom on her shoulders and the heat of a king at her back. Her mother had been settled into the sun tower, her health improving daily as the residual moon blight was purged from her system. The north was stable, the enemies were scattered, and the bond between Naira and Kael was a radiant, unbreakable bridge. Kael wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on the crown of her head. "What are you looking for?" he asked softly. "The future," Naira replied. "For the first time, I'm not seeing it through a vision. I'm seeing it with my own eyes. It's messy, Kael. There are wars coming, and there are people who will hate us for what we've done. But for the first time, I don't feel like a pawn being moved by a hand I can't see." "You're the hand now, Naira," Kael said, turning her around in his arms. He looked at her with a devotion that was almost painful to behold. "And you're not alone. I don't care if the sea rises or the sun falls. I'm staying right here." He kissed her then, a slow, deep promise that tasted of home. The final resolution wasn't a perfect peace, but a perfect partnership. Naira clung to him, her fingers digging into his back, her heart finally beating in a rhythm that was entirely her own. She wasn't the unchosen girl. She wasn't the placeholder. She was the woman who had walked through the fire and come out holding the flame. As they walked back toward the palace, the sun rose fully above the horizon, painting the world in a light so bright it made the shadows disappear. Naira looked at the gates of her home, at the warriors who were training in the courtyard, and at the man walking beside her. She felt the white wolf inside her let out a long, contented sigh. The hunt was over. The rain was just beginning. And for the first time in 15 years, Naira was exactly where she was meant to be. The story of the little sun and the Alpha King was no longer a legend whispered in the dark. It was the truth of the North, written in blood, light, and a love that had refused to stay dead. Naira took a deep breath of the cold, clean air and smiled. The future was unwritten, and she couldn't wait to start the first page.